Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will do this discussion and this evening in English. We have a lot of international audience still in this hybrid format with computers at home. So first of all, let me warmly welcome you. My name is Michael Losch. I'm a Special Envoy for Green Industrial Policy from the Federal Ministry of Climate Action. And I have the honor here to speak some opening words to you. And my first words would be to Professor Haas, here from the Technical University of Vienna. Thank you for having us here, for having organized this wonderful ambience in this Kuppelsaal, so dome of the university. So thanks a lot. Maybe we start with a big applause if we can. I have the honor here, not only in my function to welcome you in my function as Special Envoy for Green Industrial Policy, but also as Vice President of the co-organizer, the World Energy Council, Austrian chapter, and in particular also as an executive board member of the Austrian chapter of the Club of Rome. I think it is fantastic that for this debate today that we have brought together the two organizations, the Austrian chapters of these two world-class organizations. You surely all know the Club of Rome. 50 years, we celebrate 50 years anniversary. The limits to growth have been published in 1972, so it's exactly 50 years. We celebrated this earlier this year with a bigger symposium already, and we decided that it is the time that in the spirit of the Club of Rome, to accompany our current fight for climate neutrality, because it fits so well with the initial thoughts of acknowledging that the world resources have limits, and now the limits are energy, the limits are also our possibility to put CO2 in the atmosphere. We have to stop this. And of course, with technology, with a lot of brain, as happened with the original Club of Rome, that we were able to manage part of the scenarios, not all, but a lot. We still hope that we can manage and find solutions to avoid a catastrophe, but it's really late. Secondly, the World Energy Council may be a little bit less known, but actually the older organization was founded already in 1923, so after the First World War. It has its headquarters in London. We are also having in nearly all states of the world there are national chapters of the World Energy Council, and also the World Energy Council has always had the idea of accompanying energy transitions, bringing together the experts to discuss solutions for our energy systems, clean solutions, sustainable solutions in ecological, economically, and social terms. And this brings, I think, a very good symbiosis with the Club of Rome and the World Energy Council tonight. So. And it's also the idea of both organizations to have a scientific, evidence-based debate on these things, not a politically driven, hysteric debate, but on solid grounds, on empirical grounds. That's, I think, why it's so important to discuss with university, with the two professors who will hold the keynote speeches, Professor Nakicenovic, whom I would warmly welcome here, who is very known in Austria. He was also held a chair in the warm welcome. Here at the Technical University, he was vice CEO of the of the IIASA, of the International Institute for Applied System Analysis in Luxembourg for a long time, and you have been involved on EU level and international level IPCC reports and all of that. You are really known, and we are grateful that you will be here. You will hold the first keynote speech with the more international context. And then, of course, Professor Haas, who holds here the chair at this university for a long time already, and he's the head of the energy economic group at this technical university since 1996, so also quite experienced and a long time here. So we are really happy then to hear also from you your scientific approach to the problems. And let me just, as a very short introductions, organizers gave me 15 minutes. Some minutes have been run out because we started late, but some ideas still from my side to try to give a little bit an idea what was the idea behind the organizing this evening with you together. We are in a big we have a big task ahead, and if we look at if we start looking at Austria, we see that in electricity terms we are quite well. We are #1 in Europe. We have 75% of our electricity is already green, and the government has already put in place our Renewable Energy Promotion Act to achieve already by 2030 100% of unbalanced green electricity. With all the challenges which are there because of the intermittent volatile character of the renewables, but I think there we are quite on a good path, and we have currently an electricity consumption of 72 terawatt hours. I think the numbers are important. We have 54 terawatt hours about renewable, and the government has the target to add some 27 terawatt hours of renewable electricity, which is a 50% increase, because we also expect an increase of electricity consumption by 2030. And that's, of course, a big question. What will be the electricity demand in 2030? We are approaching 2030. It's only 8 years. And I remember I was involved in the projections some years ago when we made this in the ministry. Old times it started in the Ministry of Sustainability at that time. That we did take into account a lot of works that have been on the table of the Technical University also, but also of the Umweltbundesamt, of the Environmental Agency in Austria, and of the Electricity Association, Producers Association. So we had this idea that yes, there will be electromobility, there will be in the heating sector, there will be some sector coupling needing more electricity. But what we did not really calculate was the path towards climate neutrality for the industrial sector, for the heavy industry, the energy-intensive industry sector, which only has a target to become climate neutral in Austria by 2040. And if you think about steel making, cement, and chemicals, it's Austria's biggest emission sector. It's 34% of all emissions. It's larger even than the transport sector. And we see that getting to climate neutrality in this sector will not only be possible with electricity and with energy efficiency, but we will need some molecules, some green molecules to cater for also the process emissions which are there in steel making. And we will need more electricity. So how much will we need more, and how much molecules will we need? There is a lot of answers already given in the very recent hydrogen strategy of Austria, and I also would warmly welcome Judith Naya, who is here from our ministry as the new director for strategic energy policy, and she will be in the debate and maybe give a little bit more insight. So there's really this task ahead of us, and just to compare, we had 72 terawatt hours electricity and 100 terawatt hours still gas to replace. We have 100 terawatt hours fossil gas about. So the question is really, we have broad ranges of provisions, but how much will we have to cater with green gases, and how much with electricity? How much will really the demand be for gases and for electricity? So there are a lot of open questions, and I'm happy to have here a first step. A second big set of questions is the European question. Austria is in the heart of Europe, and we have interconnections in electricity and gas. We have interconnections in electricity which are high only to Germany. We have so many interconnectors that we basically could import all the electricity for the peak consumption in Austria. Of course, we cannot do that. We don't want to do that, and we cannot do that because also Germany wants to phase out coal and wants to phase out nuclear. The sum of phasing out in Germany is like 3 times Austria, what they will phase out in the next decades. So of course we cannot rely on that, but we still are embedded in the electricity market, in the European functioning electricity market. And in gas, it's even more extreme. Our gas transport system, our internal gas market, provides for transport opportunities which are manifold, reach manifold the Austrian consumption. We transit, we trade, I think 6-7 times the quantities via Austria, transit via Austria than what we consume. So we are embedded in Europe, and so the question will be, of course, what can Austria do? What has to be adapted on the European level? And I think Mr. Nakicenovic he's one of the 7 experts of the advising the European Commission in that area. So we are also very happy to hear from you a little bit more. And then the third dimension, so after the European dimension, is really the global dimension. And I would like to remember that last year in September, already from the Club of Rome, we made a session, a seminar last year about this idea of global international partnerships between Europe and between, in particular, the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa. These are our natural neighbors, and we have the big chance now in these days to also, let's say, driven by the war in Ukraine, to get out of the dependency from not only Russian gas, but also from fossil sources from the OPEC countries, and to have new partners, many more new partners, because fortunately the sun is shining in nearly all member states or all states around the MENA region, and not only the few who have a lot of fossil sources. So we can build up a complete new network of friends and partners, and not only on a few which will then maybe put pressure upon us and create a dependency. So this is a historical chance also, and I would say it's a historical chance in 3 aspects. First of all, I think, I firmly believe that the problems what we have now with Russian gas and the need to get out of this Russian gas should not lead to an idea of complete isolationism of Austria. We are so heavily embedded, and we still need to have trade relations with other states within the Union in the internal market, but also beyond. And this is also important, secondly, because we have a lot of technology companies. We have famous companies. I saw Klaus Fronius of Fronius here, and many others who have something to offer for our partners around Europe. And we have, I think, also a task not only to say to those states in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Libya, we imported now 70 years your gas, your oil, now it's dirty, we don't want that. Use it at home, use it somewhere else. No, we want to help those countries to have partnerships on let's say, but not colonialistic, but really on the same eye level, I would say, to help them to get also out of the fossil fuels, with the help and with sharing also our technologies. I think it's important from small member states like Austria to have this multiplier, this climate multiplier, and to serve as a climate ambassador for these countries, because CO2 is a worldwide problem, and I think we have to remain engaged with those countries to help them to get out of the fossil trap. And I think that's to be kept in mind, and not saying, okay, we have the problem now with Russian gas, so let's completely isolate ourselves. And finally, it has a third effect. If we have good partnership, if we are able to build up in the next, not in the next 2 years, but in the next 2 decades, in 2040, 2050, if we are able to build up good partnerships with those countries around the Mediterranean and in the Middle East, and also in Ukraine, and also in the northern, if you think about offshore wind rims of Europe. We will be able to have access also to a wide, diversified, and very cost-efficiently produced renewable energy, because in those areas there's a lot of sun. These are natural resources which don't cost anything. Fortunately, the sun and the wind is still for free. I just came back last week from Jordania, where German Vice Chancellor Habeck organized a big conference with the MENA region. And I can tell you there is a huge enthusiasm in the whole MENA region, in the Mediterranean, but also in the Near East, to get on this train, to think about these free access to these free renewables, and not depending on some oil sheikh who will close and open the oil or gas whenever he likes. So there's a huge momentum right now, and I think it's important to approach this challenge what we have, this global challenge of climate warming, with a global approach and also a European approach, and not only a national, but still to contribute on the national side. So this was my idea from the introduction, and I hope my expectations are not so high, not too high, but we have to go ahead with all the scientific knowledge we have in Austria. And with that, I would ask first Professor Nakicenovic to take the floor and to present us your ideas and your view at this immense challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this grand picture introduction and for the kind words. And I would also like to start by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to speak here, both TU Wien, but also World Energy Council and the Club of Rome Austrian chapters. Let me just say, it's a great pleasure to be back here in this wonderful, really beautiful hall. It just shows that wood is a great material, construction material. I think we all feel very, very nice in it. And also let me mention that I've been working with Reinhard Haas in the Energy Economics Institute for many years here at TU, so it's always great to be here. And I'll say a few words about WEC and the Club of Rome a little bit later. Let me start my presentation. I've chosen to talk about energy transformation for a sustainable and beautiful future, because my understanding is when we talk about energy transition, we are really talking about changes in the energy system, how we use and produce energy. But I think it needs to be embedded in the broader transition of our societies. It's not a technical economic issue alone, it's also an issue of values. So that's why I've chosen to talk about transformation for a sustainable future, and I hope that it's going to be beautiful as well. So let me then start, though, with my presentation with a metaphor from the Bible. You've all heard about the four riders of the apocalypse. The point I would like to make is that it's very easy to be depressed these days about the future, really, really easy. We have the pandemic that's still going on. We have terrible war in the middle of Europe. That means that there is a death. There will be probably also famine following from that, war and conquest. So, but instead, I would like to offer a more optimistic future. I hope that we will get out of these multiple crises that are facing us. So that's the next thing I would like to share with you. If you look here, what we have achieved over the last 200 years of industrialization indicates that we have the capacity of overcoming huge crises and challenges as humanity. Number one is, I find that always incredibly impressive, life expectancy has doubled in the last century, from about 35 years to over 70 today. Another one, when we talk about famine and lack of food, is that 1 billion people are obese, and that's of course a problem. I am also suffering a little bit from that problem. But less go hungry. About 700 million go hungry every night. But there is a fear, of course, that that number is rising by the day, even in Europe. So I think we have overcome the hunger crisis, but we need to work very hard to make sure that everybody is fed well. And then something that I find, surprising, and I think many of you will find surprising, that let me start by saying about 8 million people die worldwide from the air pollution. But more die from suicide than from war and violence. It's estimated that 10 times less, about 800,000 people die from suicide every year. Of course, we don't know that number, but that's an estimate. And about 10 times fewer die from the war and violence, on the order of 60 to 100,000 a year. So we live in despite the war, we live in an unprecedented period of relative peace. And I hope that that's going to continue. And the reason why, I think one can be confident that that might be the case is that democracies actually never fight war with each other. And about 50% of global population lives in democratic societies, and I hope that that will increase in the future. So that's I think we can deal with the crisis, but one challenge is here for all of us long term, and that is the climate change. So I want to start with that. If you look here, this is the global mean temperature since the last ice age. Please focus on the last 10,000, 9,000 years, the so-called Holocene, where the temperature has been very constant. Mother Earth has been kind to us. We could settle down, develop agriculture and early civilizations. But the last 200 years of the Industrial Revolution are the hockey stick up. And if you compare that to the Paris range, we are almost there. We are well over 1 degree global mean temperature. In Austria, well over 2.5 degrees, as we have concluded in the Austrian climate change assessment 10 years ago. Karl Steiniger is here. He was one of the co-leads. So we are in the Paris range by 2040 for sure, probably much earlier. But already today we have systems, Earth systems, that are close to tipping, like the West Antarctic ice sheet, Greenland, Arctic summer ice, alpine glaciers that we all know, and coral reefs. So this is one of the biggest threats to us, and this is why we need action. And it's possible to think about the futures that go in that direction. So let me now pay tribute to the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth. For me, that was a paradigm-changing experience. I have to say, when I got the book first in the hands, I know that there were many problems in the book from the economic side, that many criticized it at that time, but I think the main message of the book was, in fact, that business as usual is no longer possible in the long run. And this is 50 years ago. And 50 years, the world has more or less gone on the business as usual, and that's called the Great Acceleration. And here you see the graph from the book, and the green vertical curve indicates actually where we are right now. So in retrospect, it was not completely wrong that we have big challenges today. And I have a quote here from Dana Meadows. Dennis and Dana were at IIASA many, many times. In fact, IIASA and Club of Rome have very similar origins. And she said, I just want to quote this: in these days of a war, it's important to think about the history. I love to go there because it is a place of work where my friends from Hungary, Poland, Russia, and other East European countries are, because that was in the middle of the Cold War. And so I hope that also science in the future will be open. But this was a paradigm change. That's why I wanted to pay respect to the Club of Rome and Limits to Growth. And the second one is the World Energy Council, that I've been also associated for at least 30, 40 years. I know I've attended all of the congresses in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And we did one joint study with the World Energy Council called Global Energy Perspectives. And the black curves that you see about the global emissions are from that study. That study was published at the Tokyo Congress in '98, so it's almost quarter of a century old, but you can see the C1 and C2 scenarios are consistent with the 2 degrees. So even in those days, the modeling work did focus on how one can achieve climate stabilizations without losing quality of life. In the background are the Ipcc scenarios in green and red. I will not comment on them, just see the full range. There were also low scenarios like in the WEC, but the point I would like to make is the red curve. That's where we are today. So even our highest scenarios did not anticipate the extent of the Great Acceleration and what that meant for the emissions. And this is, I think, the biggest challenge we have. If you look here, this is 1 ton of CO2. And just imagine or recognize that we emit 40 billion tons every year, and last year was the highest increase ever. So we are on a different pathway than we should be on, and we have alerted to that in the Global Energy Assessment, as was also published in 2012. We hoped at that time that there would be one of the SDGs, energy, because in Millennium Development Goals, energy was not on the forefront, even though it's the key. And we concluded that there would be 3 things that one needs to do. First of all, make sure that nobody is left behind, that everybody has access to clean and sustainable energy. Second is to improve efficiency. Today, I would also say sufficiency. And double the share of renewables by 2030. I think we are on the way there, but still lots of heavy lifting, lots of Herculean effort to go there. And I think that these 3 recommendations that actually went in the SDG 7, Sustainable Development Goal 7, are still valid today from 2015. And this is how I see the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is why I would argue that the energy transition needs to be embedded in the overall transformation. You can see here in foreground 13 and 7. 13 is climate, energy. It's clear that all of these goals are related. And the reason why I like this unorderly graph is that it shows that we need to take them all together. I don't think we can pick one out. This is required to achieve the grand transformation, and energy transition, I think, then can be achieved in that context. And in the World in 2050, that's another initiative that we worked on over the past years since the SDGs have been adopted. We thought that there needs to be some scientific underpinning to the great political commitment to achieve the SDGs by 2030, and we are clearly behind doing that. And so what we have done is we have reduced the complexity of 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets. If you just think about it, it's impossible to even remember all of them, to 6 transformations that need to be achieved together. And decarbonization and energy, I would say, is the key. And that's why I put it in red here. So that's, I think, at the international level. So we know where we need to go. If you take the Sustainable Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, I think that gives us the vision that we need to achieve by the middle of the century. And in Europe, I would say we also have that vision. The European Green Deal, at least for me, is a great gift to all of the Europeans. I think it shows the way forward. If you look at the left side, all of the left side is associated with energy. So energy, again, is the key in the European Green Deal as well. The only thing that might be missing is the integrative part, that all of these 8 priority areas and not leaving anybody behind, and investments need to be also seen holistically from my view. So let me show you what the challenge is from my perspective. And we called it carbon law in a publication from a few years ago. And the reason why we called it carbon law is that if you have this vision where you want to be by 2050, namely net zero emissions, then what needs to be done is to halve the emissions every year. So from 40 billion tons today to 20 billion tons by 2030, and so on until we are close to net zero. And this is the gray area. Most of that heavy lifting has to happen in energy, but some of it, of course, in land use. But that's not enough. So there are 3 things here. One is to reduce the emissions. But the second problem is, and that's green and blue, is that the Mother Earth is kind to us. Half of our emissions are being removed by the oceans and by the biosphere. And we are weakening that because we are threatening the Earth processes. So that's going to decline. That means we have to work even harder. And that's illustrated in almost all scenarios with the brown and yellow curve, namely try to generate net negative emissions. That's going to be very difficult. For example, carbon capture together with sustainable biomass, very difficult. But I prefer the nature-based solutions, which is more sustainable agriculture, afforestation, and leaving land to nature. So that's basically, I think, the carbon law, and in my view, it's reflected in the Fit for 55 legislation package in Europe. That has trouble all of a sudden, the negotiation, even though it's 1 year old, it's not there yet, but I hope it'll be there. And below is the scientific opinion of the group of 7 chief scientific advisors to the European Commission that I have a pleasure of serving on, and we published this energy transition in Europe scientific opinion for the commissioners, also almost a year ago. And let me just share with you some of the conclusions from that work. So basically, we recommend, these are the high-level recommendations. There are many more detailed recommendations. Our recommendation was to develop flexible, efficient, and resilient energy systems in order to deliver clean, accessible, and affordable energy services by integrating decarbonized energy sources. Electrification is the key, but also hydrogen, probably blue at the beginning, but then green in the long run. But that cannot be done without the participation of all stakeholders and actors. So we argued strongly for a participatory process to have everybody on board, and that, since we also say in the report, that the low carbon lifestyle should be the preferred lifestyle. If we don't achieve that, I don't think we will make the transition that's necessary. And for that, we'll need a coordinated set of policies, measures, and instruments, including carbon pricing. And that's one of the difficulties we have today. So that was our recommendation. And as you can see, in parallel, the Fit for 55 was developed as a part of the European Green Deal. And this is how one of the trajectories for the Fit for 55 looks like. You have essentially the current emissions, halving them by 2030, perfectly consistent with the carbon law. And even here, you can see net negative emissions by 2050. So even in Europe, one of the visions is that we will not be able to do it without. I'm very skeptical how well that's going to work, but here we are, because we didn't act it when the Club of Rome published its first warning about the future. Now, this is from the IPCC, but there is a huge congruence that many, many reports go in this direction. What do we need to do? And I think that's relatively well known. What do we need to do? We should have peaked the emissions already before. Should have already happened, did not happen. So that means that we need a very steep reduction of emissions to be carbon neutral by mid-century, and then these are net negative emissions in the long run. What does that require? Well, redirecting investments immediately. That's the key. Without investments, we are not going to realize this future, in my view. Power sector needs to be decarbonized. Electrification of all end uses should be a priority. Efficiency and sufficiency, and the land use. And here are some of the recommendations: zero carbon electricity, electrified uses, low carbon fuels, carbon removal. So I will not go into the details, but this is the task ahead. And if you think that also India and China and all of the countries of the world need to do it, you can see how Herculean the effort would be. Here in Austria, and I'm sure Reinhard will talk about that, in Austria we have already the law for 100% carbon-free electricity in place, but we don't have one for the other uses, which is, I think, really important if you're going to move in that direction. And this figure I've borrowed from the Klimarate Bürgerinnen that just completed its work. I think you're all familiar with that. I just show it for the record. Our emissions, the yellow, have hovered between 80 and 90 million tons for decades. And the measures that we have in place will not get us where we need to go. Here is where we need to go. And whether it's an S-shaped pattern or a linear decline, I doubt that we can do it linearly because we didn't really start yet. But you can see how difficult that would be to be carbon neutral by 2040. So it's a huge effort. But I believe that it's feasible. The question is, will we put our minds together to do it? And also at the global level, we have scenarios that go in that direction. And this is illustrated here. This is the work of my colleagues at IIASA. It's so-called low energy demand scenario, where they look at the changes also in the structure of the energy demand. It's very difficult to realize because we all have to do it, but it's a scenario. What would need to be done? How is a different issue. And this scenario is 1.5 degree scenario. But note, there might be different ways of achieving this future, but in this particular case, what Emery Lovins called negawatts. Not produced electricity is more than half of what provides the demand, and the fossils slowly taper towards zero. Renewables play an important role, but efficiency and end-use change is the key. Now, will this happen? Well, here is my concern. This is from REN 21. These are the investments in renewables worldwide, modern renewables, about 300 billion per year, roughly speaking. And look at the bar charts back where the arrows are 10 years ago. 10 years ago in Europe, we invested 123 billion in renewables. In 2019, only 1/3 of that. Okay, you can say it increased a year later by 50%, but I think we are very far off what needs to be done, and this is why I put a priority on investments before. And please note also the developing countries are investing even more. Maybe you can say this is really good news, but it does mean that we are not investing enough, and that on top of it comes the efficiency and many other measures. And why would this be important? I think because there are multiple benefits from that. As we know right now in the current crisis, this is the import dependency. That would be one huge benefit of avoiding large import dependency we have in Europe on the left. You can see almost 60% a few years ago, and that's where Austria is as well. We are also in the range of 60% import dependency. So with zero carbon energy options and investment in that direction, that would be a huge co-benefit. The other huge co-benefit, in my view, would be the fact that renewables in most places today are still cheaper than other competing energy sources. And we shouldn't forget that, for example, if you look at the photovoltaics, we have decades of rapidly declining costs through technological learning at about 20% per doubling of the capacity worldwide. And I think that promises to continue in the future. So they're the cheapest now, but again, need investments. It won't happen by itself. So it's the same challenge, but the benefit could be economic in the long run. If we can do this upfront investment, we could benefit from the low costs in the long run. So, and the third huge co-benefit is the elimination of the air pollution to a large extent that I mentioned worldwide. Costs about 8 million lives per year. So it's one of the greatest causes of death. So this is my penultimate slide. I wanted to leave some time later on for the discussion. I hope I've not gone through the material too quickly, but I wanted to share this. This is my favorite slide, to be honest, because I think that pictures tell 1,000 words, much better than data and curves. So what you see here are 5 areas of human activities. Or services that railways provide, flying machines, telecommunication, individual mobility, and industrial processes. And whether you would pick another picture or not, let's put that to a side, I think you would agree that in periods of 50 years, we made fundamental changes, really fundamental changes in all of those and other systems. These were really fundamental transformations in periods of 5 decades. And I think what's also important is the vertical, not only horizontal, that all of the systems need to mesh together to provide the services that we need. And by 2050, they should be decarbonized. Nobody knows what the future will bring. I just put some pictures there that would be consistent with that might form a new zero energy system. All I'm trying to say is that I think it's not completely out of reach, even though we only have 30 years to get there. And let me then close by saying a few words about the new European Bauhaus. I'm exceedingly enthusiastic about that as a way of implementing the European Green Deal. The metaphor goes back to the original Bauhaus 100 years ago. The new one would be completely different. But the idea is, in addition, as you can see in the 3 bullets, in addition to sustainability, which I think we all agree is really important, to have an inclusive society where everybody feels good, and the aesthetic, the beautiful, is a very important part of it, and I think that's connected here to this hall. So maybe all of our buildings would be made out of sustainable wood like here in the future. What is really important is reuse and restructuring those systems. So I would like to stop here. Let me just share with you, I see, okay, there. That if you want to do some further reading, the 2 publications, one, The World in 2050 here, we produced 3 reports on the transformation, and the energy opinion for the European Commission from last year, both available on the website. So thank you very much. I don't know if Reinhard, you go immediately, or if you have questions at the end, no?
I suggest we first hear Professor Haas, and then we have time we can have questions.
Good afternoon. It's really a very great pleasure for me to be here today to see so many faces which are familiar to me, fighting together for a long time. And in my presentation, I have to announce now that I'm not as optimistic as Naki is. And Naki said we will make it in the next 30 years. And one reason why I'm not so optimistic is that, let's say, about 8 years ago in Paris, we had promises, and at that time it was much easier to follow this phasing out curve of carbon. But what had happened in this period of time, I would say nothing has happened. There were a lot of hot air in the speeches, but finally there was not much really brought to the ground. This is my own PV system. Actually, it has already been replaced, repowered. I have installed it in 2002, and it was one of the first at that time in Austria. Today, I will shortly repeat introduction, motivation, energy in Austria, electricity. I will look at transport, industry, and buildings, and then explain how we can, in principle, decarbonize the energy system. Potentials of renewables in Austria and the possibilities for hydrogen will, with the conclusions, complete my presentation. First, I would like to start to discuss why are we here today? We are here today if we compare our style of life with the medieval age 500 years ago. We simply have much more energy in high quality available. And energy is, turn it as you like, the fundament of our standard of life today. And all of you, every second of our life, even if we sleep deeply, we consume energy. And this has over time brought about a dramatic increase in energy consumption in the recent years, and for the future it is currently still expected that energy demand will grow, but we have at least the opportunity to decide from which sources we take. I am the academic director of this postgraduate course here at Technical University of the ACE, and in this postgraduate course we try to show and to teach how to switch to renewable energy systems. One basic question here was, and this is my only international part, how much energy do we need? Wie viel Energie braucht der Mensch? And here we can see that it depends how much energy a woman needs. For example, in the USA, it's about 80,000 kilowatt hours per capita. In Austria, it's about half, it's about 45,000 kilowatt hours per capita. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it's only 4,000 kilowatt hours per capita, that is to say, less than 10% of Austrian consumption. But what is also of interest in this picture is that the green areas show transport. And transport is largest, by far largest, in the United States. The, let's say, magenta areas show industry. And if you look at Sub-Sahara, there is no transport, there is no industry. They just try to survive. Okay, last slide to the international one, electricity per capita. Here we have Austria. Here we have Norway. So that is to say, Norway has a little bit more, almost twice, almost 3 times as Austria. And again, we can actually see here an even more different pictures than we have seen for overall energy. Let's look back, energy in Austria. In the 1980s, we had growth rates of 3 to 4% per year, and you see at least this has changed. In this slide, we have the red hatched area is oil, and we have at least hold our oil consumption constant. Yellow natural gas has overall slightly increased over time, and on the top we have green the biomass and other renewables. And I would say we are lucky that at least since about 10-15 years we have a stagnation in primary energy. This is not the ultimate target, but it's better than the still continuing growth of the past. If we just look at the renewable energy, we can see that we have in the meantime about 35% reached last year. It was not just due to the corona crisis. First major source was maybe surprisingly here hydropower. Maybe some have expected that we have relied on biomass much earlier, but then the biomass development came about, and in the last years, on the top, the yellow hatched areas is from the new renewables. Naki has already mentioned the issue of imports, so I do not repeat it. We have 60% or 67% even import of our energy. Electricity in Austria. Looking back at the history of electricity in Austria, this is the most important slide. Germany announced the Energiewende in 2011. We have announced Energiewende in 1978 when we were phasing out by a vote, phasing out of nuclear power. Now we see here in this slide how the electricity generation in Austria developed. And you see blue here is the hydropower. We have here thermal fossil fuels. This is now green energy from wind and from photovoltaics and biomass. And on the top we have imports. On the bottom we have the exports. That might be of interest and surprising because I have learned at the university Austria is an export country. We export electricity to our neighbor countries. This has obviously changed. Demand has been still growing to about up to 2005, but afterwards it was a rather moderate, and these are the so-called imports. I will show a little bit later where these imports come from. In 2020, we had this effect here of a reduction of overall electricity demand. Of course, this was due to Corona, and Dr. Losch has already announced that we have to think about how demand will develop for electricity, and this is really one of our key issues. One very important aspect is set on the margin today. With respect to electricity, we do not have excess electricity from renewables. In most single hours of the year, every additional kilowatt hour of electricity is generated from fossil fuels. Without emotions, if you buy an electric vehicle, regardless, Naki, whether it's yours or it's the electric vehicle of somebody else, if this individual does not have a serious contract for renewable electricity, these kilowatt hours will come from fossil fuels. And also, if you add heat pumps to our system today, most of this electricity will be produced in Austrian natural gas power plants, in German lignite power plants, or in Czech nuclear power plants. So no excess electricity from renewables exists, except maybe 26th of October, where we have our national holiday, and usually there is a lot of wind, and the same is for the Germans when they have their reunification day. Dr. Losch has already mentioned our target. Naki has already also focused on it, that we want to have 100% electricity by the year 2030. And this slide shows a possible pathway to reach this target. This figure also shows the black line, which is our load, and here we have historical data until about 2018. On the bottom, we have photovoltaic and wind as announced, the major additional sources. Here we have natural gas. So natural gas was already planned before to have some phase out. We will not, in our calculations, really come to zero. It is also the question how much biomass in form from biogas we can implement into the system. And we have to cover and meet this import gap. I have already mentioned today in the last years we have imported a lot of electricity because it was simply cheaper than to produce it by ourselves. The corresponding capacity for this scenario up to 2030 is shown here. So we have much more capacity from PV and wind as we have seen in the energy picture, simply because we do not produce so many full hours electricity by these technologies, but in total we will come up to about 40 gigawatt by the year 2030. The corresponding monthly electricity generation and demand is now shown here in this slide, and we see that in summertime some long-term storage is needed. And this long-term storage could be, for example, hydrogen, it can be maybe methane, it can also be any other power-to-X technology, maybe even products can be made from this excess electricity. But bear in mind this picture, in the winter months we will have just the advantage that something is in a balanced way used from the summer months. Austria and its neighbors in the electricity system, I have already mentioned, we have a lot of imports, and in real life we import from two countries physically and from one country, we can say, by means of contracts. It is clear, red imports from Germany and from Czech Republic. From Czech Republic, some say we do not do it voluntarily. It's because Germany shifts its electricity via Czech Republic to Austria. But this is the situation as a matter of fact. We have just to recognize that we say we do not like the Czech nuclear energy, but we will physically import some. What is a very important aspect in this whole development is the infrastructure. There is a discussion on the infrastructure of natural gas to be used by hydrogen, but maybe this is done a little bit later also in the discussion. And this is the situation for electricity. So we have here major projects of the Austrian power grid. for the next years? Do you think it's easy to build these additional lines? Of course, it's very expensive, but money is not the problem. And again, without emotions, there is resistance against these lines. And some of you know this phrase of "not in my backyard." That is to say, we want to have all amenities possible, from using energy and electricity-based services, but we do not really like to have the corresponding infrastructure. Next is mobility, transport. It's the worst sector. This is the share of oil products over time. We had almost unlimited growth up to about the years 2005. We can say, fortunately, afterwards, also in this slide, some stagnation is recognizable. And in recent decades, since about 2005, we also have implemented biofuels. We have blended our diesel and our gasoline already in the refinery by means of these biofuels. Blue is electricity. Electricity mainly from public transport. That is to say, if we discuss electric mobility, I think it is really very important to point out that this has in the past mainly been used for the public transport. In recent years, there was also additional electricity from cars. In the scenarios I have shown up to 2030, we have also done some sensitivity analysis. Up to 2030, we will not have significant problems with additional electricity, but afterwards, if we really extend these shares, we might have to take into account how to do it. If we think about alternatives in transport, I think it is important to recognize that we do not have zero-emission technologies. In this slide, you can see the 30% savings are possible if we switch to bioethanol as a fuel. On the right side, you can see that even 70% are possible if we switch to battery electric or fuel cell vehicles, by and large. But we will not come to zero, and this is more or less applying for all changes. We have to invest in infrastructure, we have to use CO2 for building up infrastructure, and that delays the overall CO2 saving balance. And I think this could also be an interesting point for the discussion afterwards. Next is industry. It has already very good been described by Dr. Losch. He has told us what are the problems in industry and where we have to head for. If we look at the past, we can see three major developments. First is oil phasing out, coal phasing out, we can say has been achieved. But we can also see here, this is the natural gas part, and here we had the largest increase over the last, we can say, 20 years. One other positive aspect is that also in industry, stagnation is prevailing since about 15 years. Next, the households. I have added here this special slide on overall household consumption, especially because here we see that natural gas is actually modest. We cannot say it is not important, but it is shown with a specific share and we have some diversification. We have done for the heating sector a study called Wärmewende 2050, and in this study we have, based on the historical developments, tried to show what is possible by means of improving energy efficiency for the buildings, that is to say, improving the building outdoor walls and windows quality and so on. And how can we reach 100% renewables? Actually, we would have expected that in the year 2018, when we have done the study, already a significant backlash go down of the energy consumption would take place. Now we hope that it will take place in a delayed way. But by 2050, we will then have different fractions of biomass, pellets and the wood chips, solid wood, and also district heat, as well as solar thermal. Basic principle is, here you see red is total heating energy demand, and green is the share of renewables, the part of renewables. If we would have business as usual, then total heating demand would increase further, and only if we manage to bring about an improvement of the thermal efficiency of the building in a significant way, we can really increase the share of the renewables. For the future, decarb of the energy system. How can we do it? So I have seen here different students of mine from former times. We have here Professor Nakicenovic, who was teaching with me about 10 years. So let's start with some basic equations. We have, in principle, our service demand is energy times efficiency. We have CO2 emissions, a CO2 factor times energy, and the final equation of mankind, you can say, is CO2 is the CO2 factor times service demand divided by the efficiency. We also have to take into account embedded energy. I have already mentioned it. FCO2 can be changed by a switch to renewable energy. The service demand can be changed by structure, behavior. If we have a tax, service demand for driving with the car would probably go down. And last, here we have improved the efficiency ETA. We can improve the efficiency of the car, the heating stove, the boilers, the overall building envelope. These are the three major possible strategies, measures. And we can do it by means of introducing policies. I call it the policy triangle. We can implement policy standards, for example, for the building envelope. We can introduce some way of carbon pricing, a carbon tax, emission trading systems, and we can introduce subsidies, for example, subsidies for improving the efficiency, subsidies for switching to renewable electricity, as we already had it. And then we can try to harvest the potential of renewable energy in Austria. These are 4 potential studies by different Austrian authors, and they have been documented in this Sachstandsbericht we had, was it 2014? And I have now tried to see what is the current situation. So here, the red line shows the current primary energy demand in Austria. We have, from my point of view, currently the following potentials, which also include what has been mentioned before regarding the 2030 targets, wind, PV, and hydro up to 2030. This is hydro in petajoule. This is wind, about 80 petajoule. We have photovoltaics, the biomass from agriculture. In this scenario, we have assumed that also arable land is to some extent used for growth of renewables. We have the biomass from the forest, wood, and we have biomass residuals. On the top, this is ambient heat to be used for heat pumps, and finally up to 2050 maybe some more or less large part of geothermal. So actually my colleague Wolfgang Streicher from Innsbruck has done this estimation years ago, and he was rather in favor of this use of ambient heat and geothermal things. I would like here to point out one specific issue now. It's called Schadstoffmengen, and it goes under the category here residues. That is to say, today we have in the Austrian forests still a lot of biomass which is not optimally used, and this could be done in the discussion on the green gases. So in Austria in recent, let's say, months, different studies have popped up who promote the use of green gases from different origin, and one is from this special biomass residues. And the reason why it is not used is because it is too expensive to build up the refinery for these biomass sources. I come to, I think, one of the maybe currently most controversial topics, and it's the use of hydrogen. I have already said we can use the excess electricity in summer months to produce green hydrogen. The European Union has already in 2003 set up this vision of a hydrogen-based energy system. They have also in 2003 introduced a roadmap. Unfortunately, from this roadmap up to 2020, not many targets has so far been met. It is also important to say we have different types of hydrogen. Main colors of hydrogen as shown here. We can do it from natural gas with or without CO2 capture. But of course, our favorite color here is currently green. Green electricity from electrolysis of the renewable energy sources. From my point of view, it is first important to say that there is no zero-emission technologies. I have mentioned it for transport, but it applies universally. And also hydrogen, green hydrogen is not purely zero emission. Next is we have some modest efficiency in the chains of the hydrogen use because we have the efficiency of the electrolyzer. If it's 70%, it's 30% less as of electricity. And in Austria, we have at least a discussion, will we just use purely green hydrogen, which has rather low full load hours, or will we go into gray hydrogen taken from just electricity from the grid? And another point is import of green hydrogen from the MENA countries, as has already been announced. But here we can also think about, isn't it better to use the green electricity produced in the North African countries directly for their own electricity use? I understand that it's also for these countries attractive to make good business with Europe in the context of this hydrogen trade. But I think this could be, and it has been announced in the program, also one of the major points of the following panel discussion. 2 studies on hydrogen. For Austria, we have estimated about 7 terawatt hours, which could be a potential up to 2050. And for the overall EU, we have set up from different studies shown here that we could have by 2050 about 400 terawatt hours. Last slide, my conclusions. First, as said, there is no zero emission technology. If we want to reduce the carbon emissions, it is not easy, and there is no one size fits for all approach. And we have to accept that flexibility in the overall system is much more needed in future than it has been in the past. As said, biomass, green gases. Of course, there are also potentials of other sources, but this is, from my point of view, an untapped potential, but needs investment support. As been shown, the potential of renewables in Austria is limited. It might be more that I have presented, but finally it will also be limited, and it will also be accompanied by, let's say, environmental unfriendly aspects. One very important aspect is banana. I have shown before in another way, but banana means the acceptance is not here. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. Finally, I think education is a very important aspect. We have our course here at TU Wien, ACE, and I make some ads for it. And you have also the folders regarding this course. We have co-organized this event today. And of course, one additional aspect that has to be taken into account is the issue of money. We need a lot of money for investments, for example, in the photovoltaic plants, also in the wind power plants, in the rebuild of the grid structure, infrastructure. And we have to find a way where from we get this money. It's also in the responsibility of the regulatory authority. Thank you for your attention.